1999, Andrew Wayne Edhouse was the most feared man in Kalgoorlie, Western Australia. A senior member of one of the most secretive outlaw motorcycle clubs in Australia, operating in a remote gold mining town that had its own rules and its own silence. Nobody crossed him, and nobody talked about him. When a woman disappeared inside his clubhouse on the morning of October 8, 1999, that silence held for 26 years. This is the story of how that was possible. Andrew Edhouse had been running Kalgoorlie for years before anyone outside that town had ever heard his name. If he had been operating anywhere else in Australia, the law would have found him sooner. But things were different in Kalgoorlie. The town sat 600 kilometers from the nearest major city in the middle of the Western Australian outback, and it had been running on its own terms for so long that nobody questioned the arrangement anymore. The mines pumped cash into the local economy, and that cash moved through the town without many people asking where it came from or where it went. The police were understaffed, and in some cases on the wrong side of the line they were supposed to be holding. And the people who lived and worked there had learned that some things in Kalgoorlie were simply not worth looking into. That was the town Andrew Edhouse had chosen to build his world in. And it had served him well. The Club de Rose had been formed in Western Australia in the early 1970s as one of the original 4 outlaw motorcycle clubs in the state, alongside the Coffin Cheaters, the Gypsy Jokers, and the God's Garbage Gang. But where the others were known, the Club de Rose made a deliberate choice to stay unknown. For decades, Western Australian police could not even confirm how many patched members the club had. They existed in the space between what law enforcement could prove and what the people around them were willing to say. And what those people were willing to say was nothing. By the late 1990s, the methamphetamine trade had changed what outlaw motorcycle clubs in Australia actually were. The money it generated gave them infrastructure and reach that went far beyond anything a territorial dispute over patches could produce. The Club de Rose made that transition, and Andrew Edhouse was the man running their Kalgoorlie operation at the exact moment it was happening. The money was flowing, the operation was growing, and nobody in that town was in a position to do anything about it. On one side of Boulder Road sat a Bunnings warehouse where mining workers picked up supplies before heading to the super pit. On the other side sat the Club de Rose clubhouse. From the footpath, you could not see inside it behind the high corrugated tin sheeting that surrounded it on all sides. The people of Kalgoorlie had understood for a long time that Boulder Road had 2 sides, and that only one of them was any of their business. Just inside the front door of that clubhouse, the concrete floor had 4 letters and a number pressed permanently into it. CDMC, 1%. Everyone who walked through that gate already knew what it meant and what it required of them. Murder trials and police task forces had come and gone, and he was still there on Boulder Road, making the decisions, enforcing the code, and completely out of reach of anyone who wanted to hold him accountable. It was simply the way things were in Kalgoorlie, a town built on money and silence where the people who understood which questions were not worth asking had learned that lesson long before Andrew Edhouse arrived to take advantage of it. They called him Crowy. When the police lawyer at the inquest asked him years later how he had come by that name, Edhouse said he could not remember. The people who knew him remembered differently. It had nothing to do with birds. It had everything to do with crowbars and what he did with them. Not in the heat of the moment, and not out of anger that got away from him, but deliberately the way a man does something he has decided needs doing and has thought carefully about how to do it. That was Andrew Edhouse in October 1999. Untouchable in a town that had given him everything he needed to stay that way. And on the other side of those corrugated tin walls on Boulder Road, a woman was about to walk into a night that would be the last one of her life. To understand how Andrew Edhouse became that man, you have to go back to where it started. The name Edhouse meant something in Western Australia long before it appeared in any newspaper. 3 men carried it into this story. Brian Edhouse was Andrew's brother. Robert Edhouse was Andrew's son. And across 3 decades, all 3 of them ended up in the same place, in the middle of violence they could not walk away from. Brian was the first. He was working at a mechanic's shop when a group of coffin cheaters arrived and broke both his legs with baseball bats. It was directed at Andrew, a message that said, "We can reach your family." Andrew received it and said nothing, but he was already thinking about how to answer it. He was raising Robert alone at the time, moving in and out of prison while the boy grew up around the clubhouse on Boulder Road, where the men who came and went were not strangers, but fixtures. Robert never became a bikie, but the world he grew up in left its mark. Years later, he stood in a Perth district court and received a life sentence for a murder he had planned in cold blood. The Edhouse name left behind two criminal stories, one that was solved and one that never was. The war that defined Andrew Edhouse started with a man named Kevin Woodhouse. In the world of the Club de Rose, everyone knew him as Mad Mick. He had been a club nominee, which meant the Club de Rose had brought him in, vouched for him, and given him their protection. In return, he was expected to honor his obligations to the club. One of those obligations was a debt he owed them. Mad Mick chose to skip the debt and patch over to the Coffin Cheaters instead. The Coffin Cheaters were the Club de Rose's biggest rivals in Western Australia. Leaving for them was not just a financial matter. It was a direct challenge to everything the club stood for. In May 1998, Club de Rose members walked into the Broken Hill Hotel in Victoria Park and attacked Coffin Cheaters president Edward Withnell, cutting his head open in front of the bar. The response came 4 days later when a coffin cheater was shot in the leg. What had started as one man's unpaid debt had become a war between two clubs, and neither side was willing to be the first to stop. The escalation was rapid. Western Australia police pulled over a coffin cheater just meters from the home of a Club de Rose member. In the car was a loaded, illegal automatic shotgun known on the street as the Street Sweeper. The image of that weapon made the front page of the West Australian. It was the moment ordinary people in Perth understood that what was happening in their city had moved beyond a dispute between motorcycle clubs. Western Australia Police launched a dedicated response and named it Operation Gallipoli. But Operation Gallipoli did not stop what was coming. Club de Rose member Mark Doyle was driving to work one morning when a shooter who had positioned himself in the bushes near a Roe Highway on-ramp opened fire on his car. Doyle survived but arrived at hospital with gunshot wounds to his spine. The following day, coffin cheater Mark Chabrier, known to everyone as Shabs, was shot dead in his car in Welshpool. He was well regarded across clubs, and his death hardened everything. Another coffin cheater, Mick Anderson, was shot in the arm in the same attack. Anderson was so physically large that when police arrived to arrest him, they had to link 2 pairs of handcuffs together to restrain him. The man charged with the murder of Mark Chabrier was Andrew Wayne Edhouse. The prosecution told the court that Edhouse had motive. His brother Brian had been bashed by coffin cheaters, and Edhouse was not the kind of man who absorbed that without responding. Forensic evidence linked him to the weapons used in the shooting. And an associate told police that Edhouse had confided in him about the attack, saying he had wet dreams over the shootings. The defense told the jury the investigation was built on evidence that had been forced together by a police force that wanted a conviction badly enough to overlook what did not fit. The senior officer who led the investigation had conducted an interview with Edhouse that was later ruled inadmissible after the footage of it mysteriously disappeared. That same officer was not called as a witness at the trial he had been brought in to build. After 4.5 weeks of evidence, the jury took a single day to reach their verdict. Not guilty on all counts. The murder of Chabrier, the attempted murders of Mick Anderson and Mad Mick Woodhouse. Andrew Edhouse walked out of court and went back to the clubhouse on Boulder Road. Mad Mick Woodhouse, the man whose decision to skip a debt and switch clubs had started the entire war, was shot dead in 2004 outside a Bayswater swimming center while waiting for it to open. He used his dying breath to name his killer. The man charged was tried 3 times. The final verdict was acquittal. Andrew Edhouse had walked away from everything the law had thrown at him, and that world was about to pull someone else in. A 28-year-old woman named Lisa Govan walked into that world without knowing what it was. Lisa was small, framed with wavy brown hair. That evening, she made dinner for herself and her boyfriend, Tim Hamill, before he left for his night shift at the Super Pit. With him gone and no family nearby, Lisa had nowhere to be and nothing to do. She had just lost her job, so she went out for a drink. Her night started at Di Bonelli's bar on Hannon Street, where she stayed until midnight. On her way out, she stopped at a Commonwealth Bank ATM, withdrew $50, and instead of going home, made her way to the Safari nightclub. It was 1 in the morning when she arrived alone. She had already been drinking for hours, and she kept going until the club closed at 4:30. When she left the Safari, she was not alone. She was accompanied by a man who was later identified as Andrew Edhouse. CCTV footage showed them embracing outside the club, but the same footage captured another moment. Club de Rose associate Trevor Atkinson approached the pair and appeared to strike at Lisa's neck. Edhouse stepped in. The moment passed, and from that point, Lisa got into a cab with Atkinson and headed to the Club de Rose clubhouse. It was 5 in the morning when they arrived. Other people were inside playing pool and listening to music. Lisa was visibly intoxicated. Witnesses described Edhouse and Lisa as intimate with their arms around each other and their faces close. But as the hours passed, the others began to leave. By 7:30, only 4 people remained inside that clubhouse: Lisa, Edhouse, Atkinson, and one man who had been asleep on the couch since the early hours. The last confirmed sighting of Lisa Govan was outside the clubhouse gates in the early morning light, with Edhouse and Atkinson standing beside her. After that moment, there was no confirmed sighting, no contact with her family, and no trace of her anywhere. When Tim Hamill came home from his night shift, he found the house empty. He spent the day riding around Kalgoorlie looking for her, finding nothing. At 3 in the morning on October 9th, he called police and reported her missing. It took police 5 days to search the clubhouse on Boulder Road. By the time they got inside, the signs were impossible to ignore. A section of carpet had been cut from the floor. The concrete beneath it had been repainted. The gaming machines had been moved aside so the painting could be done. There was no forensic evidence of Lisa's presence anywhere in the building. But the carpet was gone, the floor was fresh, and nobody inside the Club de Rose was saying a word about any of it. Police concluded she was dead and that she had most likely died on the morning of October 8th, 1999. Beyond that, they could not prove anything. And what nobody knew at that moment was that it would take another 25 years before anyone would even get close to an answer. But there was someone who had witnessed it all. Ross Kimberly Edwards was a plasterer in his early 30s who had come to Kalgoorlie for work. He had no connection to the Club de Rose until he found himself working for a man named Kevin Smith. Kevin was one of the biggest cocaine dealers in Kalgoorlie, and he worked for the Club de Rose. As part of the job, Kevin picked Ross up from his house every morning, and they headed to whatever work was running that day. On the morning of October 8th, 1999, the route took them past the Club de Rose clubhouse. On the first pass, Ross noticed a woman standing under the veranda of the Foundry Hotel, which sat right next door to the clubhouse. She did not look distressed, and Ross did not think anything of it. They drove on, bought a couple of bottles of Coke, and headed back. On the return, Kevin stopped at his house and came out with a small Ziploc bag of cocaine, which he placed in the center console. When they got back to the clubhouse, the woman Ross had seen at the Foundry had moved. She was now leaning against the fence at the de Rose driveway, and Andrew Edhouse had his arm on the fence right beside her. Kevin went to the front door. Ross stayed back and had a smoke. Through the metal gate, he watched a 15 to 20-minute conversation between Kevin and Edhouse, with Kevin's back to him the entire time, and Edhouse on the other side of the bars. He could not hear a word of it, but he was watching. Then Edhouse disappeared from the door and came back a short time later, passing something through the metal bars to Kevin. It was a staple gun. Kevin got back in the car without a word and dropped Ross at the job. When Kevin returned later, he was agitated and unsettled. He said they needed to talk. They drove out into the bush together. Kevin was so paranoid about being recorded that he made Ross walk 100 meters from the car before he said anything. Standing out there in the red dirt, Kevin told Ross what he had seen at that front door. He had seen Edhouse run inside and jump on top of someone. A woman. She was not alive. Ross said nothing and went back to work. Kevin's yellow Toyota Hilux, which had been parked behind the Foundry all morning, was later found hosed out and scrubbed clean with the spare wheel removed from the tray before it was washed. Ross noticed everything but did not ask questions. When police began investigating Lisa Govan's disappearance, They eventually found their way to Ross. He gave a statement, but he left out the most important things. The calculation was simple. The people he was protecting himself from were still in Kalgoorlie, and they were still watching. 2 years passed. In 2001, Ross and Kevin had a falling out over money. Ross came back to his house to find Kevin waiting with Mick Heaton, the Club de Rose enforcer. Heaton hit Ross over the head with a bottle of tomato sauce and made himself clear. "If you say anything about anything, you are next." Ross needed no clarification. Lisa Govan. He was broke and terrified. He sold his Nintendo to buy a bus ticket and got on the first bus out of Kalgoorlie. But the weight of what he knew followed him out of that town and never left. He could not stop thinking about Lisa's family, so he went back to the police and told them everything. What he could not tell them was where Lisa was. And by the time anyone was looking seriously, the people who knew that answer had already made sure it would never be found. Ross Edwards had told the police what he knew, but knowing and proving are two different things, and the people who could have filled the gap between them had already decided they never would. Police took 5 days to search the clubhouse on Boulder Road after Lisa Govan was reported missing. By the time they got inside, the floor had been repainted and the carpet had been removed. Swabs taken from what remained of the carpet did not confirm Lisa's presence at the site. But counsel assisting the coroner, Sue Markham, would later tell the court that did not necessarily mean nothing happened to her there. Police believed a white Toyota Land Cruiser ute belonging to a Club de Rose associate had been used to remove the carpet or Lisa's body from the premises that morning. The ute had been found cleaned out and hosed down with the spare wheel pulled from the tray before it was washed. Beyond that theory, there was nothing that could be taken into a courtroom. Ross had given his first statement to police in 1999, but it was incomplete. He had left out the most important things because the calculation was simple. The people he was protecting himself from were still in Kalgoorlie, and they were still watching. In the years after leaving Kalgoorlie, he went back to the police multiple times and gave further statements telling them more of what he had seen on the morning of October 8, 1999. The investigation was going nowhere. Lisa's parents, Pat and Ian, spent years being led to various sites across the Western Australian goldfields by rumors and psychics. The goldfields are not a place designed for finding things. There are hundreds of mine shafts scattered across the red dirt, holes already dug and impossible to search. Every lead produced nothing. In 2017, Western Australia Police increased the reward for information from $50,000 to $250,000. Detectives revisited Kalgoorlie, retraced Lisa's final movements, and examined possible forensic evidence connected to vehicles in the old clubhouse site. In the same period, Ian Govan wrote to the coroner's office asking about a formal inquiry into his daughter's disappearance. He was told it could not proceed because it was still an ongoing investigation. They kept waiting. In 2022, police raised the reward to $1 million. They also released CCTV footage from the Safari nightclub publicly, alongside images of the white Toyota Land Cruiser, allegedly linked to the investigation. It was the most public the case had ever been. The reward was never claimed. The people who knew what had happened to Lisa Govan had already decided that no amount of money was worth what speaking up would cost them. That same year, Detective Senior Sergeant Timothy Lines was assigned to the cold case specifically to prepare a report for the coroner. 2 years later, in November 2024, a coronial inquest finally opened in Perth. 25 years after Lisa Govan walked back through those gates on Boulder Road and was never seen again, the witnesses were finally being asked to take the stand and say what they knew. What followed was one of the most extraordinary displays of collective silence ever seen in an Australian courtroom. John Hope, known as Little John, had been a patched Club de Rose member for 17 years. He told the coroner he had no recollection of anything relevant to Lisa Govan's disappearance. Not a single conversation in 17 years inside a club whose members had been publicly accused of her murder. The coroner pointed out that it was difficult to believe a man who had spent nearly 2 decades inside that club had never once discussed a disappearance that had been on every news bulletin in Kalgoorlie for months. Little John said he had no recollection of conversations like that. Trefor Atkinson told the coroner that in 25 years he had never once spoken to Andrew Edhouse about Lisa Govan. A ripple of laughter went through the courtroom. The coroner asked him directly whether he accepted that the court would find that difficult to believe. Atkinson said he could not speak for other people. Then came Mick Heaton, the same man who had hit Ross Edwards over the head with a tomato sauce bottle and told him to stay quiet. Heaton admitted on the stand that he had spoken to Andrew Edhouse on the phone the night before his own appearance at the inquest and had spoken to Kevin Smith the night after Kevin gave his evidence. When asked what they had discussed, he said they had just been chatting about what was happening in court. Kevin Smith denied the allegations entirely. Ross Edwards appeared at the inquest and told the court what it had cost him to come forward. My first original statement there was fear for my own life, really, if I told everything and I would be next, he said. So I only told what I was told to say and not the whole truth. Then he added the line that said everything about the world he had stumbled into on the morning of October 8th, 1999. I am even nervous sitting here now. The coroner had sat through witness after witness, delivering the same carefully constructed silence. John Hope remembered nothing. Trefor Atkinson had never discussed it. Mick Heaton had just been catching up with old friends. Kevin Smith denied everything. These men had spent their entire lives inside a world where silence was enforced, not just expected, and 25 years and a coronial inquest had not changed that. But the one man whose silence mattered most had not even bothered to show up. When the 6-day coronial inquest into Lisa Govan's disappearance opened in Perth in November 2024, the man at the center of it was nowhere to be found. Police had been unable to locate Andrew Edhouse before the inquest began. Coroner Michael Jenkin told the court his whereabouts were unknown and that he may have traveled overseas. The man who had been one of the last people to see Lisa Govan alive had vanished on the eve of the proceedings that had taken 25 years to arrive. It was not the only problem before the inquest had even started. Lisa's then-boyfriend Tim Hamill could not be served and would not appear. And on the opening day, the state solicitor representing WA Police stood up and delivered an apology to the Govan family for the way the investigation had been handled. 25 years of waiting, and what the family received was an acknowledgement that the family liaison had not been good enough. What the apology did not address was that 2 detectives had turned up at the Club de Rose clubhouse on the morning of October 8, 1999, possibly while Lisa's body was still inside, and had stood outside joking with club members, 20 meters from where she may have been lying. They told the court they were there by sheer coincidence. The inquest also heard a detail that had not previously been part of the public record. A witness told the court that Lisa had been seen riding on the back of a Harley-Davidson motorcycle driven by Gypsy Jokers member Billy Grierson on the morning she disappeared. It was a detail that raised new questions about what had happened in those final hours and introduced the possibility of intergang rivalry as a factor in her death. The inquest was never able to fully resolve it. 5 months after the November 2024 hearings, the inquest was postponed. Then, in April 2025, the one witness everyone had wondered if they would ever hear from appeared on a screen in the Perth courtroom via video link from an undisclosed location. Andrew Edhouse, the man who had ruled Kalgoorlie's Underworld in 1999, appeared on a laptop screen 26 years after the morning. Everything he had built was tested in a way it had never been tested before. The session opened with technical difficulties. The court had to tell him to turn it off and turn it back on several times. Then the questioning began. He denied everything. Every question about that morning produced the same answer delivered in different words. The clubhouse. The intimate moments witnesses had described. The hours between 7 and 9 in the morning when Lisa Govan ceased to exist. Andrew Edhouse looked down the lens of that camera and said he remembered none of it. When shown CCTV footage purporting to show him with Lisa outside the Safari nightclub at 4:30 in the morning, he said, "Everyone says it is me, and it could be me." But he was not sure. The coroner pointed out that he was not saying it was not him. He was simply saying he could not remember. Edhouse agreed that was correct. counsel assisting Sue Markham ran through every possible scenario with him. An argument that got out of hand, an accident, whether he had hurt her or whether she had simply left on her own. Ed House deflected everyone. If she had left, he said he would have seen her. For every question, there was a non-answer, and every non-answer was the same calculation that had kept him out of a courtroom for 26 years. Say nothing and give them nothing they can use. The coroner pushed him directly. Can you accept that it is very difficult to believe that in 26 years you never once discussed this with anyone? Ed House thought about it and offered his one concession. He might have said something like, "What happened to that chick?" That was as far as he was willing to go. The final question came from the coroner himself. "What I want to know, Mr. Ed House, is what happened to Lisa after all of this?" His answer was 4 words. "I can't help you." Pat and Ian Govan were sitting in that courtroom watching it happen on a screen. They had been there every day of the inquest. They had spent 26 years searching mine shafts, writing letters to the coroner's office, and waiting for a moment that never came in the form they needed it to. When the coroner turned to them directly and acknowledged their courage and perseverance over 26 years, Pat Govan said later that was the moment the dam burst. Not because it was the answer they had been looking for, because it was the acknowledgement that there might never be one. In July 2025, Coroner Michael Jenkin delivered his findings. He ruled it an open finding. He was unable to determine the cause or manner of Lisa's death. He wrote that both Ed House and Atkinson knew more about what happened to Lisa than they had been willing to admit, and described the situation as a frustrating and wholly unsatisfactory state of affairs. Ed House, Atkinson, and Smith had all been arrested at various points in the preceding 26 years. Every one of them had been released. Not one of them had ever been charged with any offense in relation to Lisa's disappearance. After delivering his 4-word answer to the coroner, Andrew Ed House disconnected the call and went back to wherever he had been. His location remains unknown. He has never been charged. A retired detective who worked the case has publicly stated he knows who murdered Lisa and is confident her killer will one day be held responsible. But as of today, that confidence has not produced a charge or an arrest. Pat Govan stood outside the court on the final day and said what she had been saying for 26 years. "Our main aim is we want to bring Lisa home. Lisa Govan has never been found. Andrew Ed House has never been charged. Lisa Govan has never been found. The $1 million reward is still unclaimed. The code of silence that protected Andrew Ed House for 3 decades is the same code that turned a small motorcycle club on the docks of a Texas fishing village into one of the most powerful empires in the world." Click on the next video to see how that unfolds.